This is Treks to Nowhere. Okay, so if one were asked to identify a prominent pole somewhere on the Earth, and of course I'm not talking about our friends that hail from the country of Poland, I'm talking about a geographic pole, it's likely that they would mention either the North or South Pole. As we all know, the Earth spins around its rotational axis, and every 24 hours a new day is born, and the very extreme points of this axis mark our geographic poles. Here's where it gets confusing though, is that for each hemisphere, there are actually multiple poles. For example, each pole has 2 magnetic poles depending on the context you use. So something else that complicates our geographic poles on Earth is the precise location of where they're marked. For example, in the winter of 2015, I deployed to South Pole Station as part of an NSF-funded ice coring project. Now, before I even arrived at the station, I already knew something very specific about the actual South Pole marker, and that's that there are actually 2 official markers at South Pole Station. Now, sitting right outside of the South Pole Station, right out front, out the front window, there's a very clear and conspicuous marker for the South Pole. It looks like a barber pole, all spiraled. It's got this large silver orb on the top, and surrounding it you have over a dozen flags of all the various countries that have participated in research in Antarctica and have also signed on to the Antarctic Treaty, which is a document that was signed in the 50s, pledging that all countries would only use the continent for research. Now, sitting in the station, looking out the window at this pole, with all of its fancy decorations and flags, you would think that this is clearly the mark for 90 degrees south. But you'd be wrong. You see, back in 2007-2008, a brand new research station was opened at South Pole Station. It was dedicated that particular year. The old station was shut down, and that South Pole marker was placed such that it sat right out front of the station. Now, at the time, 15 years ago, that spot was indeed the location of 90 degrees south. So for that first year of the station's operation, you looked out that window, you were looking directly at the geographic South Pole of the Earth. But here's the thing, all of Antarctica, for the most part, is covered in ice. And ice, even though it's a solid, it can move, it can flow, it can deform. And so the ice that sits under South Pole moves, and in fact moves almost 10 meters per year. So what that means is in the 15 years since the station has opened, it has actually moved away from the geographic pole at 90 south 10 meters per year. So now 150 meters. So what that means is when you're sitting there at South Pole Station and you're looking out the window at that beautiful ceremonial pole, that's all it is ceremonial. It doesn't actually mark the geographic South Pole of the world. So if you were to go out there with your GPS and look at it, it would say 89.997 or something like that, as opposed to 90.0. Now, if you do happen to end up at South Pole Station, if you go 150 meters from the station itself, what you will find is a second marker for South Pole. This one's much more inconspicuous. It's a simple pole with a small little orb on top, and it's in front of a sign. And that location marks the exact point of 90 south. Now, that marker is not moved every single day, even though it should be, but it is moved once a year. So on January 1st, every year after the station celebrates the holidays, there is a ceremony that's held out at the true South Pole where they move that marker from where it is presently to where it should be at 90 south. Now, during my 2015 deployment, I can recall witnessing a rather unbelievable and bewildering development as I sat in the galley one day eating breakfast. So here's what happened. I was sitting there eating breakfast, sort of staring off into space out at the expansive white ice sheet. And what happened next was a small plane came in and landed on our skiway. Now I remember thinking that it was a little bit strange as we weren't supposed to get a flight that day. And even if we were, most of the flights we do get are these large LC-130 military Hercules cargo planes that bring all of our supplies to the station. And this was a smaller plane. As the people started to file off the plane, I noticed that they had coats with different flags representing all sorts of different countries of the world. And I immediately realized that this was a group of essentially tourists. So most of the personnel that you find at South Pole Station are either scientists, researchers, or the support staff for those researchers. However, there is a small percentage of people that visit the South Pole that are simply there on their own dime. And so there is a few companies that exist around the world where for the right price, usually tens of thousands of dollars, you can essentially charter a flight to the South Pole, and you will basically fly through South America and then pop over to a small research facility called Union Glacier. And then from there, you'll take a day trip to South Pole. And when I say day trip, that's an exaggeration. What really happens is you get on a plane, they fly you to South Pole, they push you off the plane, you scamper over to the pole for 20 minutes, take a few pictures, and then scamper back on the plane. And that's it. $40,000 and you visited the pole for 30 minutes. Right? And so that's exactly what this flight was. It was a flight of about 15 people from all over the world that had paid thousands of dollars to visit the South Pole. But here's what absolutely floored me. This 15 people, they got off the plane, tired, cold, having just traveled from who knows where around the world, multiple flights, multiple days in the air. They got off the plane. They were shuttled onto some snowmobiles. They were zipped over to the ceremonial pole. They all gathered around, laughing. You could tell they were happy, taking pictures of each other, jumping, doing goofy shots. But then got back on the snowmobiles, rode back to the plane, and flew away. So what's wrong with this picture? Well, here you have 15 people that spent tens of thousands of dollars to visit the South Pole, and they never actually did. The South Pole was 150 meters away at the true 90 South. And I'm watching this whole thing unfold from the window of the galley, just absolutely flabbergasted that someone would spend that much money and time researching how to get to the South Pole, and then get there and not actually know that you have to walk 150 meters away to the other marker to actually set foot on 90 South. And I couldn't compute that, because when I arrived at the station just a week prior, the very first thing that I did before I even set foot into the station for my briefing was I scampered over that 150 meters to the true pole marker, checked my GPS, took a couple photos for posterity, and I was like, boom, I visited the South Pole. Anything else now is just sugar on top. So all I'm trying to say with this story is that while you might think that the geographic poles of Earth are this very obvious and easy thing to define, it gets tricky, especially when you factor in things like the flow of the ice sheet. And if you don't do your research, you end up like one of these 15 tourists who had this amazing line item on their bucket list and spent all of their retirement on it and never actually did it. Interesting side story is that same year I was deployed, as the entire station was celebrating New Year's Eve on December 31st, about 5 minutes before we struck midnight, I snuck outside and took a picture at the pole right as midnight flipped. And so now, when I'm in a fun meeting or conference and we're going around the room telling everybody fun facts about ourselves, I always tell people, as a matter of fact, I was the first person to the South Pole in 2016. And I think that's kind of fun. Now, if you really want to spin your brain in circles, I'll leave you to ponder this thought. What time zone is the South Pole in? So, in addition to these somewhat obvious geographic poles, there's also a rather odd and quirky type of pole known as a pole of inaccessibility. Now, these poles are explicitly bounded by a specific landmass or body of water. And as their name would imply, they mark locations that are truly inaccessible. But what exactly does that mean? So, In the summer of 2016, I was presented with the opportunity to visit one of these poles of inaccessibility. But before I tell that story, I want to tell one more backstory to put it all into context. During a previous deployment to Antarctica back in 2010, I remember standing in the science laboratory in McMurdo Station. Now, McMurdo Station is sort of the primary station where all US scientists come through to stage all their equipment, set up all their logistics, and refresh any training that you might have had that expired. Now, while I was standing there in the science facility, talking with my co-advisor about field logistics, my eyes kept wandering over to this very large USGS map of Antarctica. Now, I've looked at this map hundreds of times, and I've always just kind of noticed different things on it. Every time you look at it, you see something new. Now, in this particular instance, something rather peculiar caught my eye. You see, this map denotes the location of all of the research stations on the continent. So all of the Australian stations, the New Zealand stations, the Russian stations, the US stations, they're all identified. And as I was scanning around the map, I noticed a station identified as the Pole of Inaccessibility. And it was clearly marked as a Russian station. Now, when I saw this, my very first thought was, what the heck is a pole of inaccessibility? That makes no sense. It's a contradiction. If it's truly inaccessible, why is there a station there? Now, rather than ask my advisor an embarrassing question, I instead waited till we were done chatting and I walked over to one of the computers in the lab and I simply looked it up. And what I came to learn was actually really fascinating. So back in the 50s, the Russians had carried out several Antarctic traverses. And on one of these traverses, they went through this very specific point, the Pole of Inaccessibility, and they decided to set up a station there. So the Russians figured, well, let's plant our proverbial flag here. It's a little weird, it's a little quirky, but it's also kind of a fun story. Let's plant a flag at the Pole of Inaccessibility, which also happens to be the coldest mean annual temperature of anywhere on Earth. It sits at 12,000 feet. And they decided to build this very crude Spartan station. Now, ultimately, they only ran the station for a single season, and they only took some meteorological measurements. They didn't really do any other primary research at the station. It was mostly just a flex. You know, we put our station here, and then they left. However, before they left, they erected a 30-foot tall tower, and at the top, placed a bust of Vladimir Lenin, so that any future explorers that happen to come across this rather quirky spot would be welcomed by this glorious bust of Lenin. Well, as you can imagine, in the 60+ years since that was erected, snow has continued to fall and not melt and just accumulate year after year. And so that 30-foot tower is now buried so far that the only thing that remains above the surface is the very top of the head of Lenin. And in fact, by next year, the entire statue will probably be buried under the surface. Now, with all this said, I still haven't explicitly told you what a pole of inaccessibility is. So here's what it is. A pole of inaccessibility is the point within a given landmass, usually a continent, that marks the farthest inland you can go if you factor in all of the coastlines. So that sounds confusing, but the easiest way to think of it is like this. If you take a landmass, let's say North America or Antarctica, and you draw the largest circle that you can inscribed within the continent, such that none of the outer edge of the circle is touching any of the coastlines, the center of that circle would mark the pole of inaccessibility. So what that means is if we take the geography that we know, with all of the inherent and systemic uncertainties, and we plug that into our best models, what we get are the poles of inaccessibility for the major continents with a certain level of uncertainty. Now, a new paper came out about 10 to 15 years ago where the authors did just that. They wrote a brand new algorithm, very precise, and they were able to calculate poles of inaccessibility for every continent within an error of about 15 to 20 kilometers. Now, where my story comes in is after I saw that point on the map in the Science Center at McMurdo, and I searched around, I stumbled serendipitously across this paper, and it really planted the seed in my mind of, that is a really interesting and fascinating spot that I must visit. Now, if you do a cursory search for the North American Pole of Inaccessibility, what you'll find is that it's located in a remote and rural part of South Dakota, somewhere in the rough vicinity of the town of Allen. So, in short, after being intrigued by this random point on an Antarctic map, and then reading this paper about poles of inaccessibility, the idea of visiting the North American Pole of Inaccessibility was born. Now, despite the uncertainties published in this paper for each of the poles of inaccessibility, I still decided to sort of treat their findings as gospel. And so we get to the trek to nowhere, my visit to the North American Pole of Inaccessibility in rural South Dakota. In the summer of 2016, my partner and I were on a road trip adventure in the Black Hills area of South Dakota. Now, we had driven up from the Denver area with the idea that we'd visit some very obvious places like Custer State Park and Mount Rushmore, Black Elk Peak, and various other well-known places. Now, when the time came for us to end our trip, I realized that by making a slight detour, we would actually be driving very close to the town of Allen. And it was like a light bulb went off and I realized this is the place. We can go right now and visit the Pole of Inaccessibility. Now, as I was doing my research on visiting this location, I actually stumbled across a trip report from another traveler named Jerry. Now, Jerry is a retired surveyor by trade, and he had all sorts of very valuable information about the specific location. And it was through his tips and guidance that I was able to plan this rather ad hoc trip on our way back to Denver and actually successfully navigate to this point. Now, as we neared the Pole of Inaccessibility, there were certainly parcels of land that were fenced off and clearly no trespassing. But when we got to the place that Jerry had identified as the easiest access point to the pole's location, it was unfenced and open land. So, on a random day in July in 2016, my partner and I arrived at a small dirt road in the middle of South Dakota, and we started a half-mile trek down a very overgrown hillside to this obscure North American pole. Now, the actual trek down to the pole went fairly smoothly. It was definitely overgrown, a lot of thickets and brambles and weeds, but for the most part, the footing was stable and the terrain was easy to hike on. And because of that, we made the hike in really quick time. So we dropped down a few hundred feet from the road and then hiked about 1,000 feet through a little grassy drainage area and eventually came up on a small copse of trees that marked the actual area of the Pole of Inaccessibility. As we sort of pushed our way through a bunch of brambles and bushes and made our way up to this random location in the woods, my GPS started going off, started chirping at me, and eventually I got to a single spot and it said, "You have arrived." When I looked up, I noticed the two trees right in front of me, very obvious from some of the photos that Jerry had sent me, so I knew I was in the right location. There we were, in this random place in the woods, two seemingly insignificant trees behind me, a bunch of weeds and thickets and fresh cow droppings on the ground. Not too exciting, you might think. On top of that, there was these really awful gnats that were constantly buzzing around our faces. It was 100 degrees, the humidity was pretty high. For all intents and purposes, you would think that it would be a pretty miserable experience standing there in the July sun in the middle of overgrown, weed-infested South Dakota. However, that was not the case. I was as giddy as you can imagine, smiling, giggling, taking all sorts of photos and videos. I checked my GPS to match the coordinates. I even had an old cereal box that I wrote a welcome message on and placed at the tree so that any future explorers that came through would see that this marked the Pole of Inaccessibility as well. So we had a grand old time. We spent about 20 minutes there just giggling, being silly geographiles. I am at the North American Pole of Inaccessibility. Yeah, not a whole lot to do here. Admiring this seemingly insignificant place that just about anyone else in the world wouldn't even pay attention to or think twice about, and yet we were there running circles around the pole just because why not, right? Eventually we decided it was time to move on, so we packed up our few things, drank some water, made the short hike back to the car for what we thought was going to be a glorious end to our little excursion to this random pole in North America. However, it didn't quite go that way. You see, on the way back to our car, we chose slightly separate routes. While my partner decided to go back the same way we came, I decided to be a little more cavalier and adventurous and take this route higher up on the hill slope. Of course, the downside to that was that I had to push my way through these really overgrown thickets and bushes and high grass, and I didn't really think much of it at the time, and I just wanted to get back to the car and explore a different area. Now, when we got back to the car, everything seemed fine. It started to get really uncomfortably hot out. I had sweat dripping down my face, and I was wearing this thin merino wool layer that was long sleeve to protect from sunburn. And so I decided, okay, I'm taking this thing off. I'm just too darn hot. And when I looked down at my arm, I noticed a small tick crawling on me. No big deal. And I pulled it off and chucked it into the grass. But I thought, okay, well, I should still check. It's always prudent to do a tick check. And so I unzipped my layer, took it off, and that's when I saw the 30+ ticks crawling all over that wool layer. I immediately looked down and then started to see the ticks crawling on my pants as well. And despite my familiarity with ticks, seeing that many crawling all over me incited the most ridiculous panic attack you can possibly imagine. Within seconds, I was tearing all of my clothes off because I was convinced I had ticks crawling everywhere on my skin. So I stripped down all the way to my underwear, standing on this random road in the middle of South Dakota in my underwear. Eventually, I calmed down and I assessed the situation, and we did a full spot check of both me and my clothing, and we did find over 30 ticks on my clothing. I did have all brand new fresh clothes in the car, so we removed all the ticks that we could find. We checked myself multiple times over and over and over again. And when I finally had convinced myself that I was clear, I put all of my contaminated clothing in a special bag and put all fresh new clothing on and took a deep sigh and thought, it can't possibly get any worse than that. Thank God that's over. It did in fact get worse, and here's how. You remember a little while ago when I was telling you about that really annoying swarm of gnats that was flying all around our heads? Well, it turns out they weren't gnats. They were a very tenacious species of black fly known as buffalo gnats. And incidentally, I'm apparently allergic to them. Now, while I've certainly had my share of black fly bites on the East Coast, this particular species does not agree with me. And so while I was there, standing on that dirt road in my underwear, little did I know that while I was ridding myself of one parasite, another was quite literally eating me alive. And so got back into the car in my brand new clothes, and that's when I started to notice the itching. And within about an hour, I realized I was covered in over 100 very itchy, prominent red bumps. And I'll tell you something, of all the mosquito bites or bug bites and spider bites I've ever had in my life, I have never experienced torture like I have with these damn black fly bites. And so, as I wrap up this trek to nowhere, you might be asking yourself, well, do you think the trip was still worth it, given all of these challenges that you faced with various parasites? And I will tell you, without hesitation, a resounding and confident yes. Visiting the North American Pole of Inaccessibility was one of the most fascinating and goofy places that I have ever visited. Of course, with all this said, if you are thinking of visiting the Pole of Inaccessibility yourself, I would give you this one piece of advice. Be sure to bring some DEET and permethrin along with you. Thank you so much for following along on this trek to nowhere as we rambled about various geographic poles on the planet and revisited my trek to the North American Pole of Inaccessibility. Take care, everyone. Be safe, and I'll see you in the next video.